demonstrate all of the MIDI skills and techniques required for you to get the full marks in the exam. Obviously, you have to use these skills musically and to the context of the brief that's laid out in the exam. So just watching this isn't going to be enough. You're going to have to use this video to understand how to use the skills and then practice them using projects so that you can prepare yourself for the exam. So I'm going to start with the bottom row, which is use of preset library sounds. Preset library sound is just a software instrument that's already been pre-made. So if we had a pre-made software instrument and then we look in the library and we can find a sound. So if our song requires something, I don't know, to be energetic or something, we can pick instruments that fit that, whatever that means to you as a composer. So I'm going to go with a synthesizer, a lead one, and then I can audition them by listening to them. Open up my keyboard, Command K, and then there we go. Try and find something that I think is exciting or whatever meets the brief. Doing this, we have achieved this. We're using a preset library sound. Done. Now the next part, to get the next point, you have to selection of appropriate and complementary sounds from the library. So appropriate and complementary means that they have to fit the brief and work well together. So that means you need more than one sound. So let me get rid of that. So if I'm using this sound here, I'm going to need something else that fits into that electronic field rather than maybe a standard real acoustic drum kit. So I'm going to add a different sound now, a different instrument, and I'm going to look for something that's complementary to it. Kind of sounds like an 80s drum machine. That will go well with the snare, with the synthesizer. So there we are. I've selected complementary library sounds. Done. Obviously, as I said before, this is all about the brief. So whatever the brief says, you have to match instruments with that. So try some out. Find ones that complement each other and work well. Your ears will tell you if they work well or not, because you'll know instantly these two things just don't fit in the same world. For example, if I was to add an orchestral instrument to this, this and that, to my ears, don't fit like they complement each other. They're from different sound worlds and so aren't going to really be working well to a brief. Moving on to the next part, evidence of a selection and combination of appropriate complementary sounds. Well, the only difference there is the word evidence. So you're going to have to evidence this using screenshots in your report and tell them these are why I've used these instruments. Why are they appropriate? Moving on to the last part, to get the full mark on this bottom section, evidence of the selection and combination of a varied palette of sounds, including edited software instruments. So we're going to have to edit some of these instruments so that they fit better within our music, or perhaps they change as the piece goes on. So let's have a look at how we can edit a software instrument. So I'm going to close down the library and I'm going to open up the inspector. Now, the inspector for a software instrument will have the very first thing on it here. That will be the actual instrument, the software instrument. Now, if I open this up, I'll have access to different settings where I can edit the instrument. So, for example, if I play the kick, I can see that this is highlighted, and I can also edit the kick. Change the pitch. I can add drive to it, and whatever else. I mean, as long as you evidence it, and obviously this needs to work for your song. You can't just be editing it just for the sake of it. It has to be for a purpose. So you might find that your hi-hats don't sound as good as you want them to, so we can affect that. Or maybe add some delay to them. Or whatever. I mean, as long as you edit it and you evidence that you've edited it, that's all it's asking for. So that is the bottom row of this table here. Now we're going to go to the top, where it says basic MIDI programming skills, repetition of events, parts and objects with pitch and timing errors. So I'm going to show you now how to make a MIDI event which has got parts with pitch and timing errors. So to make an event, you just right click and create a MIDI region. To add information to it, you double click on it, and then you can draw it in the editor window at the bottom. To listen to it, we can just loop this area here. Okay, now this doesn't have any timing errors because all of my lines, all of my MIDI notes are lined up exactly to the grid that you can see. So if you wanted to score lower, you would have to draw these out of time. And we can hear, if we put the click on, that they're out of time. Let me just quantize them back into place. Now in terms of pitch errors, you can't really draw the wrong pitch on a drum kit because they don't really have pitched, they don't have notes. But if I go to my lead synth here, for example, and my song was in the key of C major or A minor, so we've got all of the white keys, and now I start drawing in black notes. They will be out of tune with everything else that's in the project. So to make sure that they are in the right pitch, we just have to make sure that our notes are in the same key as everything else. Now that can be done by moving them, transposing them to the right key. Alternatively, you can quantize them using major scale quantize function here, and there we are, it snapped them. This is an automatic process, so sometimes it goes well, sometimes it snaps it to a note that you're not so happy with, but it's a process that you can use. So that was basic MIDI programming skills. Then it says repetition of events. So at the moment, we don't have any repetition of events. We need to repeat these to get that first one. So I'm going to click Option or Alt and then drag and make a repeated version. There we are. I've now repeated those events. Okay, so moving on from this one to this bracket here, accurate MIDI programming skills, repetition of events and parts and objects. So we've repeated the parts, and we can check that everything is lined up to the grid. If it's lined up to the grid, it's in time. If it's not lined up to the grid, it's not in time. Moving on to the next section here. Accurate MIDI programming skills, repetition of events, parts and objects, including instances of transposition. So instances means that it's happened, you've used transposition a couple of times. So let's go and create some transposition. So for that, I'm going to be working on this MIDI event here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to transpose it using pitch. So I'm going to select my notes, and transposition just means moving the notes to a different pitch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag them across. So I've got a copy of them. Now that's just time transposition because I've placed them somewhere else in the bar, but I'm also going to be moving them up a pitch. And that's transposed them. Now, what's happened here is I've transposed them, but I've created pitch errors. Why is that? Well, that's because when I move them up, I've not quantized them to C major scale. You can see that this note here is on a black note. This one here is also on a black note. So I'm going to have to do some transposition, some scale quantization. And now that's cured it of its timing errors, of its pitch errors. Let me get rid of some of that glide. So I'm going to edit this instrument and reduce the glide so it's less. Just want a little bit. There we are. Okay, so instances of transposition. So that's one instance of transposition. We need to do some more. So let me think what I could do here. I could transpose some of the drum notes to different sounds. So at the moment, this sounds like this. Well, I can transpose some of these notes to a different instrument on the drum kit. There we go. 2 instances of transposition. Another example of this would be, let me just add a synth pad. Software instrument. Just look for a synthesizer pad. See what this sounds like. Okay. So create a MIDI region. And I'm just going to play D minor in the background. So let's say you have a chord in your song. We can easily transpose some of the notes in that chord, so every time we repeat it, it's a little bit more interesting. So let me make this last a whole bar. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat this twice. Double click on it. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to transpose one of the notes in the chord to the same place, to the same note, just an octave higher. So I'm going to take this A and drag it until it says +12, which is also an A. And there we can hear that note. We can also transpose some of these notes down. And still the same chord. It does the same thing, but now we've created a variation on it just using a tool called Transposition. Okay, moving on. So we've now got our instances of transposition, our MIDI's accurate. The next part here says accurate and advanced MIDI programming skills involving the use of multiple parts per track and objects of different durations. So in one track, there needs to be multiple parts and they have to have different durations. So let's have a look. So at the moment, in this track here, let me just glue these two together. Every single note is the same length. So it wants different durations. So we could do that. Multiple parts per track, we haven't done that, but we have created objects with different durations. So let's write a different part into this track here. So we have could draw a different part, like a bass part below. That's terrible, doesn't sound good down there. Let's bring that there. I'm going to change the velocity on this so it's louder. And just to make it really obvious, I'm going to bring the velocity of those down. And now we have multiple parts, objects with different durations, in one MIDI region, a bass part and some chords. And the chords have got different durations as well. So that's top row completed. Now let's have a look at the next line down. Isolated evidence of MIDI programming to a fixed tempo grid with default settings. Okay. So that means our notes are programmed to the fixed tempo grid with the default settings. The default settings are always that the notes line up to the 16th note. What this is hinting at is the use of different settings, which can be found here. So we can snap some of our rhythms and some of our notes to different settings. Let's have a look at our drums. So let's just get some hi-hats in there. So I could draw some 16th note hi-hats. That's not a hi-hat. I've got to take scale quantize off or it won't let me draw a hi-hat because it happens to be on a black note. So my notes are now drawn to a 16th note. That's because that's the default setting. Well, if I wanted to draw 8th notes, I could select that here. And now my notes are a different duration, well, a different rhythm. I could use swing. So we're going to need to use 16th note swing. And similarly here, I could use 8th note swing. just loop this one here by grabbing it from the top right and dragging it. So now we're moving away from just using the 16th note grid that Logic gives you and actually using 8th notes. We can even use triplets, we can use swing and be more expressive, be more creative and force ourselves slightly out of the generic 16th note tempo grid. With the use of quantization, so the next part says evidence of MIDI programming to a fixed tempo grid with the use of quantization in default settings. Okay, so this one's going to be hard for you to prove if you don't use a screenshot. So if you had drawn a part in or performed it in, or you dragged it in from the project and it was out of time, you can use Q or quantization to quantize it, to snap it to the tempo grid that you've selected here. So let's say we had dragged this part here. Let me just make a copy of it. Let's say the project gave us this part here. And we're looking at it and we see that some parts aren't fixed to the tempo grid and they might need fixing. So we'd need to select them and use the default setting tempo grid, which is 16th note, and then hit the Q button and then get rid of the swing, and then there we go. They would now be back on the tempo grid. They will give you stuff that is out of time, so that when you quantize it to the fixed grid, like this, for example, this bass note here, when we press quantize, you'll see that it doesn't snap to the first 16th note, but it snaps to the second one. This is to catch you out. So what they expect you to see is this note here is a kick drum, therefore it should probably be right at the beginning on the first beat of the bar. Now if we snap it to a 16th, it's going to go to the closest 16th line. But it should actually be on the first note of the first beat of the bar. So we could use an 8th note, select just that note, quantize it, and there we are now. It's quantized to the right place. So evidence of programming to a tempo grid showing use of other settings for quantization, showing musical selectivity. So you're going to have to show them that you're going to use other settings here, not just the 16th note grid. This would be really useful in a second section of your music. For example, if you had a bridge, or if you wanted to create an introduction which was slightly different to the rest of the song. Yeah. So prove to them that you can use different settings, that everything isn't just lined up to the 16th note grid. The next part here is evidence of MIDI programming to a tempo grid showing use of varied quantization settings as a writing tool that enhances the musicality of the piece. So what they're going to see here is they want to see varied use throughout the piece and proof of it, and that it's been used in a musical way. That means that you've used it in a way that sounds good and effective. The key here is if you quantize one instrument, you should also quantize the instruments that play at the same time as that instrument. For example, let me get rid of that glide. And let's make this a bit duller by bringing down the filter. Okay, so at the moment, the notes in this region are all snapped to a 16th grid. We can see that because they all line up with the tempo grid. These notes here also line up, so these two work really well together. The notes happen at the same time. Now, if I want to swing these notes here, 16th swung, you can see that they've moved away from the tempo grid. I would have to, they now play slightly after the notes on the synthesizer. To make this musical, I would also have to apply the same swing to the synthesizer. Now, this note here is at the same time as this note here. So, we've covered this section here, we've covered this section here, we've covered this section here. Moving on to the last part. Inconsistent use of velocity and expression. Velocity is how loud that particular note is, and it's seen in color. So, for example, an inconsistent use of velocity would be something like this. We have one note that's super loud, and then the rest of the notes are very quiet. That would be inconsistent. Consistent would be the notes would be at a similar velocity range. Taking this further, you can then apply accents. That means certain notes are louder than others, and that brings the ears, the listener's attention to it because it's louder. We can use that to stress notes that we feel are important or line up to strong beats. So inconsistent use of velocity is where the velocity is not consistent and you might be missing out on some notes. Some notes are way too loud than others. Consistent means that they're now pretty much all within the same velocity range. Appropriate use of velocity would be using these things like accents or bringing down notes that are less important. So we're taking it a little bit further. Now, if we go and focus on the word expression, that can mean multiple things, but the first place where we can see the word expression is in the MIDI automation. So let me just show you on a different instrument. We'll go back to the chords from before. So expression can be found in the automation button in the editor. We can then select expression from the drop-down menu. It's a very interesting one because it sounds completely different on every software instrument, so it's worthwhile experimenting with. So I'm going to turn it on by clicking on a note. And I want this to get more expressive across the two bars that it's playing. So I'm going to click a note and bring it up. I'm going to click a note and bring it down here. And in this instance, in this instrument, it sounds like it's volume. Now, you might be thinking, well, I can just do that with volume automation. And you're not wrong, you could. But as a MIDI note, but they want you to prove that you can do it with MIDI. So there we are. So that's how you can do some MIDI expression. The next thing they're going to want to see is moving on to this one here, expression and controllers. Okay, well, A controller is something that allows you to control the sound. We all have one built into Logic, Command K. Now we have the ability to play notes on here. But we can also pitch bend and modulate the sound. So let's explore how that sounds. So that's pitch bend. It will pitch bend it down 2 semitones or up 2 semitones. And similarly, let's have a look at the modulation. So what we have here is it's changing the sound, making it brighter as we modulate it up. Okay, now this says consistent use of expression and velocity. We've done that. Now it says we want controllers being used. So what we can do is we're going to record some controller information here. I'm going to copy this section twice. And I'm not going to need the editor for this function here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to record me changing the pitch of this. Now if I press play back, I won't actually have to play any of these notes. It should be recorded into the MIDI region. I'm now going to use the controller to record some modulation changes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the sound brighter across the 4 bars that it plays. Press play, it should do it by itself. So I've now used the controller to add that automation in. If I want to see it and edit it, I don't need the controller anymore. I can double click on this. And we can see that the used modulations, the used automations has been modulation. There it is, recorded in orange. The expression, the note velocity, and the pitch bend. And if we want to, we can go and edit those or even delete them. So that's using controllers in MIDI, recording that in. Evidence of consistent and appropriate use of velocity, expression, and controllers that contribute to the musical feel. Well, to get that musical feel, you're going to have to explore and experiment with the controllers to find ways that really suit your music and help it to go in the direction that the brief needs it to go. That is a recap of how to do all of the MIDI skills and techniques.